Hi guys, welcome to this first video in my June series of Q&A videos that I'm doing on my Patreon account. So this is the first one. This one is open to the public. I asked a bunch of people, both my patrons and on social media, like, okay, shoot me your questions and I'll answer them in these videos. This first one is a public one, but there are also going to be a bunch of videos for my patrons themselves. So go to patreon.com/Demeere to see everything. There's a lot there. But in the meantime, you can watch this one. So I'm gonna get right into it. So this is a question I got from James Stan, and James said, "Do you believe in styles? If so, do you believe that certain styles suit certain people better than others, either mentally or physically? Or would you see this as a pedagogic question rather than a style person? Curious on your thoughts about this." In general, yes, there are definitely styles, and it makes a difference. And this is true in, I wouldn't say everything, but in most topics or endeavors or skills or whatever, you will find styles. Give you an example, painting. You can look at a painting by Da Vinci, let's say. Look at one of Da Vinci's paintings and compare it to one by Magritte, one of my compatriots. It's completely different. It's still painting. There are more similarities than there are differences when you look at the raw materials used, the techniques used, and so on. However, once you dig down into it, when you look at the whole that is painting, art painting in particular, then you will find radical differences so that it's completely different style. And I'm sure that if Da Vinci were to be able to see one of Magritte's paintings and vice versa, well, vice versa is true obviously, but if Da Vinci would have been able to see one of Magritte's paintings, he would have been very much intrigued by what he saw, basically just on a technical level. Now, the point then quickly is made, which one is best, which painting is best. Well, that depends. That's beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So I wouldn't be able to make a comment about that. The point is that there are clear, distinct styles. It's not the same thing, not by any stretch of the imagination. So yes, I believe there is something like styles. Now, when you talk about styles, basically what you're also talking about is systems. So that you can say that, for instance, let's take Shotokan Karate, which is originally an Okinawan style. We can talk about the history and so on, but that is a very localized version of looking at martial arts, self-defense, and what have you. Compare that to Wing Chun, which is a Chinese style, which has a totally different background, totally different history, and a very different approach to techniques, training, and so on. Then you will see that it's a very definitive difference between both of these, the different systems. I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that if you start from Shotokan and go to Wing Chun or vice versa, you will find that it's quite difficult at first because of all those differences. So my point would be that yes, there are extreme differences between styles when you look at everything all over the world, and it it gets to be a little bit complicated after a while. Now, I talked about this in detail in one of my podcast episodes. You could go to wimsblog.com/21, so 21, the number, and you get to the episode about martial arts as systems, in which I go into much more detail, which I won't do here. Um, but I will talk a little bit more in a second, just to give you a comparison that will be easy to follow, as most people are well aware of it. So what I would say is, when you look at physically speaking, is a certain style more applicable or useful or practical for a certain kind of person? I believe so. For instance, I'm not a good fit for Taekwondo. I'm too heavy. I'm a heavyweight, so I don't have the build for it. I don't also have the temperament for it. I do like high kicking techniques, spin techniques. I used to do a lot of that when I did competitive training, but truth be told, that wasn't really. I mean, as a heavyweight, that wasn't really the best way to fight for me. And in particular, as I get older, I'm 47 as I am talking to you here. Well, I don't see myself jumping around in my 50s or 60s. There are many other arts, however, that I can keep on doing. So I believe when it comes to the purely physical aspect, for sure, that systems make a difference. When you look at the mental aspect, was what you also asked, are certain styles better suited mentally speaking? I believe so too. For instance, and this might surprise you, but Japanese arts aren't for me. I have nothing against them at all. I did them when I started training. I started with judo and jiu-jitsu, traditional jiu-jitsu, uh, many years ago. Now, I love Japanese culture. It's awesome. I'm extremely intrigued by it, and I would love to visit Japan one day. It's on my bucket list. So nothing against Japanese martial arts on any level, only that, for instance, the strict etiquette that you find in most dojos, which is an integral part of Japanese culture, it doesn't work well for me. That doesn't suit my personality. And I found that working within the confines of that etiquette, it's just that just doesn't work for me. I know a bunch of schools nowadays do it differently, that the etiquette is not as strict, but for me that's just it doesn't work. I mainly for the past 30 plus years practice Chinese martial arts and Southeast Asian and so on. And a lot of it was that for instance, in Chinese martial arts, you just show up to class. There may be a salutation in the beginning of class and at the end, and that's pretty much it. You maybe do a quick salutation to towards your partner when you begin to work with them and so on, but that's about it. There's no strict hierarchy. There's no strict enforcement of etiquette rules and so on. And the same thing is true for many other techniques that I see. For instance, I remember when I was very young seeing two jiu-jitsu brown belts. They were prepping for their black belt and they were training this kata that they were doing, and it was a weapons kata. And they were spending almost as much time on the bowing, the picking up of first the knife, using it for a technique, bowing again, stepping back, well measured steps, kneeling down, putting the knife back down, bowing again, grabbing the stick that they were going to use next, bowing, getting up, and everything was measured. And they were spending so much time on the preparation and the etiquette that it was, I mean, it was about half the actual time that they spent on the mat was done that stuff. Whereas from in my class, when I teach weapons, I'm like, right, everybody grab your swords. Everybody walks over, grab the swords, come back, we start training. That's it. So, and that suits me much more. Now, that doesn't mean that there's something against etiquette and so on. I just believe that there are different ways that work better for me as a martial artist that I feel more comfortable with, and that's just me personally. So that's one way of looking at it. Now I'll talk about something else when we talk about styles. And so let's consider grappling, groundwork, right? So because it's all over the place for the last few decades, ever since the Gracies basically rose to prominence in the UFC. Here's an example. There are, to the best of my knowledge, and I've been looking for decades, there is not a single Chinese martial art that comes anywhere close to the ground techniques that you find in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Not even close. The only thing that I have found is what is called dog boxing. I think that's from Fujian province. And it is a sort of ground system, and the idea is to take the opponent down, but it's completely different from BJJ. I mean, it's not even in the same realm, other than it's also on the ground. And they have some sort of control techniques and so on, but there is nothing comparable when it comes to the systematic approach that you see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu use to control an opponent and finish it on the ground. So both styles, when you look at them, are systems of ground fighting, but they are completely different from each other. So how can that not make a difference? Why? I don't see how it's possible to not believe that styles matter when you look at that example. But I can dig deeper than that as well. Let's take Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and compare it to 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu by Eddie Bravo. Now, Eddie learned from Jean-Jacques Machado, and Jean-Jacques, one of the things that is particular to him is he was unfortunately born with birth defects, missing fingers on one hand, so he couldn't use regular grips like you could do that you see the Gracies do. He couldn't, he's missing the fingers, it's not working. So he couldn't do it the exact same way. So that apparently changed his emphasis on how he would use underhooks and so on, as opposed to grabbing the gi and using his fingers because he didn't have them. So that starts a different branch of a system, so to speak. I'm generalizing, but you get the point. So the idea is that once you see that branch off, that from what some consider the root of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the Gracie family, it branches off. Okay, and then we have Eddie, who also branches off and does his own thing with it. And nobody can say that 10th planet Jiu-Jitsu doesn't work. Just like Machado Jiu-Jitsu, you can't say it doesn't work. Same thing about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, you can't say it doesn't work. They're all different though, they're different systems. They've got a very different emphasis and different requirements. For instance, 10th planet Jiu-Jitsu, you need a certain amount of flexibility to do the rubber guard. I don't have it anymore. I used to, but because of my injuries, my flexibility has gotten better the last few years, but just using the rubber guard doesn't work for me. So I don't use it. So that is a physical limitation for me to use 10th planet Jiu-Jitsu or to go really far in that style because my hips don't allow it. As a result, that style is pretty much closed off from me. So, and I know there are ways to mitigate the need for flexibility, but if you want to get really far, I do believe that you need a fair amount of flexibility in your hips. So that's a limitation. So that's one comparison between two styles, which I mean, you can't ignore the fact that they're very different styles. Let's zoom out a little bit now, and instead of just looking at different jiu-jitsu styles, let's look at, for instance, Brazilian jiu-jitsu versus catch-as-catch-can wrestling, which is also an extremely effective method of ground fighting. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's been proven just as well as BJJ has proven itself in the arena on that front. Well, I'm oversimplifying because I don't want to make this a 2 hour talk, but what you have mainly in BJJs, what you see is a step-by-step progression. So you get the opponent on the ground, try to get him under control, get to a dominant position, and then you advance methodically towards some sort of choke or lock or whatever. And that is the typical process that you see BJJ practitioners use. Nothing wrong with that. Everything they do is aligned with that kind of strategy, with that kind of mindset. Now, catch-as-catch-can guys will very often have a very different approach, and they tend to be more fluid. They tend to put a lot of pressure on their opponent and then chain wrestle and go from one technique to the next. And the mindset is more that if one technique doesn't work, there's bound to be an opening for something else if you keep the pressure on. And a perfect example of that, and you can find it online on YouTube, is you watch the Enlister against Josh Barnett. And that was one of the metamorphoses much years ago. And I think the Enlister hadn't been submitted for 10 years. And Josh Barnett just used catch-as-catch-can wrestling to put him under a huge amount of pressure for the entire match. And he finished it at the end. And there you can see that the difference in strategy and techniques, sometimes in small details, sometimes very explicitly so, from totally different systems. That's where you see systems at play. I don't think that there's not even a fraction of a doubt that both men come from a very different system trying to do the same thing. So how can you deny that systems exist? I don't see why people would even try to do that. For me personally, I like both. My personality is more suited to catch-as-catch-can. For instance, my personal MMA ground philosophy is position, pressure, pain. So yes, position is important, but I believe that you should do your utmost to put a lot of pressure on your opponent, and by all means give him a bunch of pain to think about while you go from one thing to the next or while you try to create openings. I will gladly grind the point of my elbow in somebody's shoulder to open up the possibility for either Kimura or any other technique that I get from side control if he's defending well. Gladly do that. I will gladly put the point of my elbow in the hinge of the jaw to open up another technique. So pain for me is an integral part of it, but that tends to get you disqualified in a fair amount of BJJ tournaments. So nothing wrong with that. It's just that's my approach. But then again, I don't just practice that type of ground techniques for only MMA, because I always have one eye open towards self-defense, where my focus is a lot more not just on submitting the guy, but also, for instance, stopping him from getting to a weapon, uh, making sure that I can get up right away if there's a second opponent, and so on. So my focus is slightly different. And that's why the way that I teach and the way I practice will look very awkward when a BJJ guy watches me practice, because to him probably it won't make sense some of the things that I'm doing, but my stuff is geared towards my personal goals. So then you see that from system to systems within a certain, let's say, family of styles, just looking at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, compare it to Machado Jiu-Jitsu, compare it to Tenth Planet, and so on. And then you look a little bit wider, looking at grappling systems, see how catch can is very different from BJJ, and so on. So you see that systems play a huge role, let alone when you look at systems that are completely different. When you compare BJJ as a martial art for self-defense, not the sports variation, but you look at it for self-defense, compare that to, doesn't really matter what you want to compare it to, but let's just say Pencak Silat. Very different, because they have a lot of weapons usually that are involved in what they do, or compared to Filipino martial arts, Kalyani's and so on, where weapons form an integral part of what they do. Okay, well, how does your system address that? How do you view, for instance, ground fighting in such a system when the assumption is that the guy will be armed? Whereas in sports, BJJ or catch can wrestling, the assumption is that there are no weapons because that's not allowed. So, and then you get the sports, self-defense, martial arts, contrast, and so on. So I believe that there's no doubt in my mind that systems exist and that they are important, and that you have to make your own choices depending on your personal goals, your personal physical makeup. Some things might work great for you, others might not. Um, and also you have to find a teacher that teaches in such a way that you feel comfortable with what he does and you actually want to learn from him, and you have this path towards progress, as opposed to just doing that art for a couple of months and then like, man, can't really do much here, and then always hopping from one to the next. So which is very different as well. And then there's a final aspect that I want to mention, is that certain systems are compatible, and you have that. What It's been a while, but if I'm not mistaken, you look at Bachichuan, then there's kind of like a sister style Pigua, which is something that is compatible. And what you do in one style is not emphasized in the other, so you're kind of complementing both each other with first learning the one and then the other. And I've seen that in many systems that you see practitioners start with one style and then they want to, for instance, specialize in something. Well, then they specialize in something that is very adjacent in mindset, technique, and so on, to the style they're already mastered or that they're already well experienced in, as opposed to doing something that is completely different, which is fine. You can do that, but you're going to have to start from scratch. Whereas if you start with something that's very, very similar and has and there's a lot of parallels, then it becomes a lot easier to learn that new style. So those are my thoughts on styles. So yes, styles matter. Finding a style that works for you can be quite difficult. So I would say that just keep looking, keep training, keep practicing. Eventually you'll find what you're looking for. But yeah, they exist and they matter. That's it, James. I hope this is useful for you. Everybody else, so during the whole month of June, it's 2019, obviously, I will be taking questions. If you got questions, go ahead, hit me up on Facebook. Just send comment on one of my posts there, send me a message there, it's fine. Or you can go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere. So that's where I'm going to post the videos. And hit me up with a question there, and we'll see. I'll see what I can come up with as far as answers go. That's it, guys. Thank you. Take care.